I cut off the church's entire funding in the middle of Sunday service because the same people praying in the front row had thrown me out like trash the night before. That was the truth. Clean, ugly, impossible to soften. I stood at the back of the sanctuary with a cheap gray suitcase beside me, the kind you buy in a hurry because the life you thought was stable suddenly falls apart in one night. One wheel was cracked. It dragged across the polished floor with a dry scraping sound every time I moved it. That sound should have embarrassed me. Instead, it kept me steady. It reminded me what had happened. It reminded me not to hesitate. The church was full. Sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows and painted the pews in red and blue bands of light. The choir had just finished singing. The air still held that soft hum of organ music and perfume and polished wood. People sat with their backs straight and their hands folded, wearing their Sunday clothes and their Sunday expressions. Peaceful, respectable, good. Then there was the front row. Margaret Cole sat there in a navy suit with pearl earrings and a Bible in her lap. Like dignity itself had taken human form and chosen her body. She had one ankle crossed over the other, one gloved hand resting on the pew, chin lifted just enough to signal status without appearing obvious about it. That was Margaret's favorite performance. She never reached for power in a loud way. She arranged herself as if power had always belonged to her. Beside her sat my husband, Ethan. He looked clean, calm, rested. The exact opposite of me. He did not glance back. Not once. 12 hours earlier, he had stood in his mother's entryway while she told me to get out. He had watched me gather clothes with shaking hands. He had watched me wrap my grandmother's old cardigan around a frame photo so it would not crack in my suitcase. He had watched me stand there with rain blowing through the open doorway, waiting for him to say something, anything. My name. Stay. This is not right. Let us talk. He said nothing. You ever look at someone you loved for years and feel your heart go cold so fast it scares you? That was me that morning. The pastor stood at the pulpit with his palms open, voice smooth and warm. He was in the middle of one of his favorite themes, generosity, sacrifice. How communities are built by the faithful. How light enters the world through the hands of those willing to give. Then he smiled toward the front row. And we are especially grateful, he said, for families like the Coles whose continued devotion and support keep this church alive. A wave of approving applause moved through the room to the east Chapel Chapel. I almost laughed out loud. Because if these people had known where the money really came from, that applause would have died in their throats. My fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. The metal bit into my skin. Good. Pain is useful when you need to stay focused. The night before came back to me in sharp pieces. Margaret standing in the doorway with her arms folded, the smell of rain on the front steps, her voice crisp and disgusted. You contribute nothing to this family. Nothing. That word had landed harder than I expected, not because it was true, because it was such a perfect summary of how they had trained themselves to see me, useful when convenient, invisible when not, a helper, a background figure, an extension of the house, nothing. And yet, the lights above Margaret's head had been paid for with my money. The new roof over the fellowship hall, the pantry expansion, the scholarship fund for single mothers, the van the youth ministry used for outreach, the restored pipe organ, the stained glass repair after the storm. 2 summers ago, every time people praise the church for growing, for serving, for surviving, they were praising something my money had protected. 3 years earlier, when my grandmother died, she left me a private trust. Quiet, carefully structured. Difficult to trace unless you knew exactly what to look for. I was 26 at the time and still naive enough to think secrecy could be a form of humility. I did not want attention. I did not want my name on brass plaques or church bulletins or donor walls. I told myself the point of giving was the giving, not the recognition. So I gave anonymously. At first, it felt beautiful. I believed I was supporting a place that healed people. I believed I was helping Ethan's family serve their community. I believed Margaret, who spoke so often about faith and responsibility, was exactly who she pretended to be. I was wrong about almost everything. The pastor continued talking, but his words washed over me now. Margaret accepted the praise with a restrained smile. Ethan leaned toward her and whispered something. She nodded once, satisfied. That tiny exchange lit something inside me. Not rage. Rage is hot and wild and messy. This was colder. This was clarity. I stepped into the aisle. My boot heels struck the floor with a small hard click, then the other one. A few people turned, then more. The broken suitcase wheel scraped behind me, louder now in the hush between the pastor's sentences. Heads shifted, brows furrowed. I saw recognition flicker across faces. Concern on some, curiosity on most. I kept walking. Past the side pews, past the family with 3 children on the left, past the old deacon who used to pat my shoulder and say, you are such a blessing to that family, Lena. Past the donation box Margaret loved to stand beside after service, greeting people as if kindness originated from her. The closer I got to the front, the lighter I felt. That surprised me. You would think betrayal weighs you down. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it strips the fear off you first. I stopped at the end of the center aisle and looked up at the altar. The polished wood gleamed under the morning light. The flowers on either side were fresh, white lilies. Margaret's choice. Elegant, pure. The kind of flower people use when they want to look holy without having to be. Then I looked at the front row again. They had no idea who kept this place alive. My lips curved into the smallest smile. Not warm, not forgiving, controlled. For the first time since Margaret opened that door and told me to leave, I did not feel discarded. I felt dangerous. And if you have ever been dismissed for too long, you know that moment. The moment the room still sees the old version of you, but you are already gone. In your place stands someone they do not recognize yet. Someone who has stopped asking to be loved and started deciding what justice looks like. I rested one hand on my suitcase and took a slow breath. Would you have stayed quiet after that? Because I was done staying quiet. Chapter 2. People love a woman like Margaret Cole when they only know her from a distance. At church, she was Grace with lipstick, the one who remembered anniversaries, sent meal trains, arranged flowers for funerals, led women's Bible study, and always knew which camera angle made her charity work look the most sincere in the church newsletter. She had mastered that polished honeyed tone certain women use when they want to sound humble while making sure everybody notices how much more refined they are than the rest of the room. When I first met her, I wanted her approval. That is the embarrassing part. Not that she fooled other people, that she fooled me. Ethan and I met at a volunteer fundraiser the church hosted for a youth shelter. He was funny in a quiet way, easy to talk to, with a face that always looked a little tired and a little kind. He had a way of listening that made me feel seen. Or maybe I only thought I was being seen because I wanted to be. There is a difference, and I learned it too late. We dated for 2 years before we married. During that time, Margaret was warm enough to keep me hopeful. She hugged me at the right moments, called me sweetheart, told people she was thrilled Ethan had found a grounded, capable woman. Back then, I thought capable was a compliment. Later, I realized it was a job description. The shift began the week after the wedding. Ethan and I were supposed to move into a small townhouse he had been renting. Instead, Margaret cried in the kitchen one evening over tea and lemon cake and said she was overwhelmed taking care of the large house alone since her husband died. She said the church depended on her. She said the neighborhood had changed. She said family should support family. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table and said it would only be temporary. Temporary turned into living in Margaret's house. Temporary turned into me handling grocery lists, appointments, dry cleaning, the church bake sale calendar, and the annual donor dinner seating chart because Margaret was stretched thin. Temporary turned into her knocking on our bedroom door at 6 in the morning with a list of errands and a smile that never reached her eyes. At first, I tried to please her. I cooked the dishes she liked. I learned how Ethan preferred his shirts folded because apparently she had always folded them properly and I had not. I organized pantry shelves, relabeled storage bins, called repairmen, handled thank you cards after church events. I balanced my own consulting work from a laptop at the breakfast nook while making sure the roast was in the oven by 4 and the silver was polished before guests arrived. Whenever people praised Margaret for hosting flawlessly, she would touch my elbow and say, "Lena helps." Just that. Lena helps. Like I was a folding chair or a serving spoon. The humiliations were rarely dramatic. That was what made them so effective. Death by 1,000 polished cuts. At dinner, she would say, "Lena is still learning how our family does things." If I contributed an idea at planning meetings, she would smile with pity and say, "That is sweet, but let the adults work through the details." When church members complimented a fundraiser I had basically built from scratch, Margaret would say, "Oh, I gave her some structure. She needs structure." Ethan hated conflict more than he loved truth. That was the core of him. Though I did not name it back then. He would comfort me in private, kiss my forehead, tell me Margaret was old-fashioned, stressed, difficult, lonely. He always had a reason that did not require him to stand up to her. "She does appreciate you," he would say. No, she appreciated my labor. That is not the same thing. The money started as small family contributions. Margaret would mention church budget shortfalls over breakfast, repairs, scholarship requests, pantry needs. I had the trust from my grandmother and enough investment income to help without feeling it. Ethan knew I had family money, though he did not know the full structure. I told him I wanted to support the church anonymously because I believed quiet giving was cleaner. He called that beautiful. Margaret called it wise stewardship once she realized there would be no public attention attached to the source. The first check I sent through the trust covered roof repairs after a storm. Margaret cried when the contractor's invoice was paid on time. She hugged me so tightly my shoulder hurt. "I knew God brought you into this family for a reason," she whispered. At the time, that line made me tear up. Later, it made me sick. The church expanded its food pantry 6 months after that. Then the youth program. Then the scholarship fund. Then the restoration of the old sanctuary windows. Every time a need surfaced, I covered it quietly, efficiently, through legal structures that kept my name off public records but preserved my authority over the money. I thought anonymity would protect the integrity of the gift. Instead, it created the perfect environment for parasites. The first public humiliation that truly opened my eyes happened during the annual stewardship gala. Margaret loved that event. Men in suits, women in jewel tones. Tables draped in white linen, centerpieces with candles and ivy. A room full of people trying to look gracious while calculating each other's wealth through shoes and watches and surnames. Margaret moved through that room like royalty. I had spent 3 weeks building the event. Seating charts, menu changes, sponsorship confirmations, auction lot descriptions, donor packets, volunteers scheduling, and last minute stage lighting because apparently the dimmers were wrong and only I had noticed. My feet ached before guests even arrived. My hair smelled like hairspray and printer toner. Near the end of the night, the pastor thanked several key supporters from the stage. Margaret was one of the first names he mentioned. He praised her tireless service, her vision, her generosity. The crowd clapped. She rose gracefully, one hand at her chest, smiling like modesty itself. Then the pastor added, "And of course, we thank Lena as well for helping behind the scenes." The room gave a small, polite applause, the kind reserved for caterers and interns. Margaret laughed softly into her napkin and said, loud enough for the table around us to hear, "We all do what we can." I felt that in my bones. Not because it was the worst thing she had ever done, because it was the cleanest summary of the lie they had built around me. I was labor without ownership, support without visibility, money without identity. That was the first crack. After that night, I started paying closer attention. At first, it was instinct more than suspicion. A delayed invoice here, a donor reimbursement there, a receipt Margaret asked me to file later, numbers that fell off by just enough to itch at the back of my mind. I had grown up around careful financial management because my grandmother trusted systems more than appearances. She taught me to look at timing, patterns, habits. People reveal themselves in repetition, she used to say. So I began to trace repetition. I reviewed trust disbursements and church reporting separately, quietly. At night, in the guest room office after everyone had gone to bed, the house would settle into silence. Around midnight, old wood creaking, plumbing ticking, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, I would sit under the yellow lamp with my laptop open and my pulse low and steady. At first, I found what I expected to find: renovation costs, outreach expenses, maintenance, program budgets. Then I found the missing amounts. Not enough to trigger alarm immediately. Too neat for that. A private dining expense coded as hospitality. A resort deposit slipped under retreat planning. Boutique purchases routed through event decor reimbursements. A personal driver expense buried in transportation. I remember the exact physical feeling. My mouth went dry, my shoulders locked. The room seemed to tilt just slightly, as if truth had entered it and the floor needed to adjust. I went back further, then further. Pattern after pattern emerged. Money from the trust was being used to prop up Margaret's lifestyle and Ethan's. Not all of it. That would have been stupid. Just enough to blur the line and feed their habits. Luxury purchases, travel, administrative expenses that paid for comfort. Public generosity financed by private theft. I sat in that chair until almost 3 a.m, staring at the screen, the glow flattening everything around me into shadow. You ever have a moment when your heart breaks, but your mind gets sharper? That was mine. The next morning, Margaret walked into the kitchen in a cream silk blouse and said, "Lena, the church is considering another family assistance initiative. We may need to give a little more this quarter." A little more. She said it while reaching for imported jam with one manicured hand. Sunlight caught the diamond on her finger. Ethan sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, nodding along like this was all reasonable. I looked at both of them and saw them clearly for the first time. Not misunderstood. Not flawed. Not complicated. Entitled. I did not confront them. Confrontation is a gift when you do it too early. It warns people. It lets them prepare. It gives them time to rewrite history and call you emotional. No, I did something better. I became agreeable. I smiled. I nodded. I asked if they wanted more coffee. Then I called my attorney from my car in the grocery store parking lot. By the end of that week, I had legal copies of every trust authorization, every disbursement mechanism, every reporting obligation, and every breach point. I hired an independent forensic accountant, then another. I wanted no weak spots, no room for Margaret's polished denials, no space for Ethan's wounded confusion. The findings came back worse than I expected. Misuse of charitable funds is ugly enough. What made it obscene was the performance wrapped around it. Margaret had not just been stealing. She had been using the theft to polish her image as a righteous benefactor. Ethan, meanwhile, had used the same money to cushion his business failures in networking, lifestyle, restaurant tabs, club memberships, weekend trips that had nothing to do with ministry or donor relations. I printed everything, every transfer, every receipt, every coded lie. Then came the night they threw me out. Margaret had hosted a dinner for regional church leaders and a handful of wealthy members she wanted to impress. I handled the food, the floral arrangements, the place settings, and the guest logistics because, of course, I did. Ethan spent the evening laughing too loudly at men he wanted approval from. Margaret floated through the room in deep green satin, touching shoulders, collecting compliments, directing the rhythm of every conversation like a conductor. At one point, I overheard a guest say, "Margaret, I do not know how you do it all. The ministry, the hosting, the giving." Margaret smiled. "You simply do what the Lord calls you to do." I nearly dropped the tray in my hands. After the guests left, I found Ethan in the study with 2 glasses of whiskey. Margaret was there too. They had that look people get when they have already agreed on something unpleasant and are just waiting for you to arrive so they can perform it. Margaret spoke first. "This arrangement has become unsustainable." I stayed standing. Ethan would not meet my eyes. Margaret folded her hands. "You live here. You work from here. You benefit from this family's reputation, and yet your contribution is inconsistent." My contribution? I almost laughed. Then she said the line I will remember for the rest of my life. "You contribute nothing of real value." Nothing of real value. There it was again. Cleaner this time. Sharper. I looked at Ethan. "Are you going to say anything?" He stared at the amber in his glass for a second too long, then said, "Maybe space would be good for everyone right now." That sentence did something permanent to me. Not the words themselves, the softness, the cowardice, the way he dressed betrayal as a practical suggestion. Margaret stood and opened the study door. "You should gather your things tonight." Rain had started by the time I zipped my suitcase. My hand shook only once when I reached for my grandmother's cardigan. I passed Ethan in the hallway and stopped. He looked miserable. Weak men often do at the exact moment they become cruel. It does not make them less cruel. "You know this is wrong," I said. He rubbed his jaw. "I do not want this to get ugly." I gave him a long, level look. He still did not understand. Ugly had already begun. I slept that night in a hotel 5 miles away. I did not cry. I reviewed documents until dawn. By Sunday morning, every wire had been prepared. Every authorization had been executed. Every temporary suspension had become permanent. The trust accounts that funded the church had been closed to the institution pending investigation. The legal notices were ready to send. The auditors had been retained. My attorney had specifically advised me to avoid public spectacle. Good advice? I ignored it. Because there are moments when truth belongs in daylight. And if they wanted to stand in the front row and worship their own image, then I wanted the collapse to happen where everyone could see it. Would you have done the same? Chapter 3. The pastor was still looking at me with careful confusion, the way people do when they sense a disruption but still believe good manners can contain it. And we are honored, he repeated, one hand resting on the pulpit, to announce another generous contribution from the Colt family, which will allow us to launch the new. No, I said. My voice cut through the sanctuary so cleanly it startled even me. The pastor stopped. The room tightened. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Calm lands harder than shouting when the room expects you to beg. Margaret turned first. Her smile vanished almost instantly, but not all at once. It broke in stages. Surprise, irritation, warning. Ethan twisted in his seat and stared at me as if I had stepped over a grave. I walked the rest of the aisle slowly, the broken suitcase wheel scraping behind me like a blade being pulled across stone. People leaned outward to watch me pass. I heard a whisper on my left. Then another. My pulse was steady, my breathing even. Fear had left my body sometime before sunrise. I stopped near the front pew and faced the platform. The pastor cleared his throat. Lena, perhaps we can speak after the service. No, I said again, this time softer. We are going to speak now. Margaret rose with a controlled smile that looked painful around the edges. Lena, honey, you are upset. This is not the time. Honey, I almost admired the audacity. I set my suitcase upright and rested my hands on the handle. You threw me out of your house last night. Gasps moved through the sanctuary like a breeze. Tiny. Quick. Involuntary. Margaret's eyes flashed. That is a private family matter. No, I said. It stopped being private the moment you decided to call me worthless after living off my money. Dead silence. The pastor blinked. Ethan stood up halfway, then stopped, frozen between instinct and spine. Margaret laughed, short and brittle. I do not know what kind of scene you think you are creating. I am not creating a scene. I reached into my bag and removed a slim leather folder. I am ending one. I walked up the 2 steps to the platform before anyone thought to stop me. The pastor moved aside automatically, as if some part of him sensed authority before understanding its source. I placed the folder on the pulpit and opened it. Paper has a sound when truth is about to ruin someone. Crisp. Final. I am the anonymous donor, I said. The sentence landed and sat there. Faces in the pews emptied. A woman near the center pressed one hand to her throat. An older man leaned forward as if he had misheard me. Margaret's voice sharpened. That is absurd. I did not look at her. Every major unrestricted gift this church has received in the last 3 years came from a private trust under my control. Roof repairs, pantry expansion, scholarship funding, window restoration, vehicle acquisition, utility stabilization, staff retention during the winter shortfall. All of it. Now I looked at the pastor. You may want to sit down. He did not sit, but his hand gripped the back of a chair behind him. Ethan climbed fully to his feet. Lena, stop. I turned to him then. You do not get to tell me when to stop. You gave up that privilege when you let your mother put me out on the porch like garbage. His face drained. Margaret moved toward the steps. Pastor, this is a misunderstanding. Lena has always been emotional under stress. There it was. The oldest trick in the book. Rebrand truth as instability. I pulled another document from the folder and held it high enough for the front rows to see the seal. This is not emotion. This is legal authorization. Effective as of 7:30 this morning. all funding streams from the Carter Family Trust to Grace Fellowship Church have been terminated pending financial investigation. The pastor looked at me, then at the paper, then down at his phone as if he were afraid of what he would find there. He found it. His mouth opened slightly. Oh my God, he whispered before catching himself. The operating reserve transfer was reversed. Not reversed, I said. Stopped. The room erupted into whispers, not loud at first, more like the sound of dry leaves scraping over pavement, then sharper. Questions. Names. Numbers. I saw heads turn toward Margaret, toward Ethan, toward the deacons. Margaret lifted her chin. This is a vindictive stunt. I opened the second folder. This, I said, is the vindictive part. I placed copies of the forensic summary on the pulpit. Itemized disbursement, irregularities, coded reimbursements, luxury spending hidden inside ministry lines, personal enrichment routed through charitable expense categories, dates, amounts, vendor names, private account transfers. The pastor stared down at the pages, eyes moving faster and faster. Margaret took one step back. Ethan looked like he was about to be sick. I retained independent accountants, I said, twice. Their findings have already been forwarded to legal counsel and to the church board. Full audits are underway. One of the elders stood up in the second row. Margaret, what is she talking about? Margaret spread her hands in perfect disbelief. I have no idea what fabricated nonsense. Do not, I said quietly. She stopped. I do not know what my face looked like in that moment, but it made her stop. You have spent years speaking about truth from this front row, I said. So let us try some. You used charitable funds to pay for your private driver last spring. You billed a resort deposit as planning costs. You charged boutique purchases to donor hospitality. Ethan used church-linked administrative accounts to cover personal travel and business entertainment. You both assumed the anonymous donor would never look closely enough to notice. A low, horrified murmur rippled through the room. Ethan came forward, palms out. It was not like that. I laughed once, not because anything was funny, because lies get pathetic once they lose their costume. Then tell them what it was like. He could not. Of course, he could not. Margaret tried a different tactic. Even if there were accounting errors, public humiliation is cruel and unnecessary. I turned slowly and looked straight at her. You threw me out in the rain. Her lips parted, but no words came. You looked me in the face after years of using my labor, my money, and my silence, and you told me I contributed nothing of real value. So no, Margaret. Public humiliation was not unnecessary. It was overdue. You could feel the room shifting then. Not just reacting, reevaluating. Every fundraiser, every speech, every newsletter photo, every self-congratulatory prayer. People were taking the polished image they had swallowed for years and turning it over in their minds, suddenly seeing the seams. The head deacon walked to the front and asked the pastor for the papers. The pastor handed them over with trembling fingers. Another elder joined him, then another. Margaret looked around as if she expected someone to rescue her with status alone. No one did. One woman in the third row said, not quietly enough. She paid for the pantry. Another answered, all this time. A man near the side aisle muttered, my family donated for that roof drive. The sound in the room was no longer whispers. It was fracture. Ethan took another step toward me. Lena, please. We can talk about this privately. The audacity of weak men never stops amazing me. They betray you in public and then beg for privacy when consequences arrive. No, I said, we are done talking privately. I closed the folder. Here's what happens next. The trust is gone. The interim legal hold begins today. The audit proceeds. Any funds improperly used will be pursued. If the board wants this church to survive, it will do so without the people who treated it like a stage set for their own vanity. The pastor looked shattered. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He had believed what was easiest to believe. People do that all the time around power dressed as piety. The head deacon faced the room. His voice cracked, but he managed authority. The service is adjourned. The board will meet immediately. That was it. That tiny sentence snapped the illusion. People stood all at once, some with outrage, some with confusion, some with the hungry fascination people get when scandal finally grows large enough to justify their suspicions. A few came toward me. Others backed away from Margaret as if dishonesty were contagious. Margaret grabbed Ethan's arm hard enough that I saw him wince. "Do not just stand there," she hissed, but stand there was all he could do. He looked at me with the hollow, dawning horror of a man who has just realized that passivity was not neutral after all, that by doing nothing he had chosen. That silence carries a price. I picked up my suitcase. Before I stepped down from the platform, I leaned slightly toward Margaret and spoke low enough that only she and Ethan could hear me. "You were right about one thing," I said. "Family reveals character." Then I walked away. The scrape of that broken wheel followed me down the aisle while the sanctuary swelled behind me in a storm of whispers, raised voices, and the sound of a carefully built empire collapsing all at once. By Tuesday, the board had suspended Margaret from all leadership roles. By Thursday, Ethan had resigned from the finance committee for personal reasons, which was a soft little phrase people use when the truth would sound worse, printed in a church bulletin. By the following week, the local paper had gotten hold of the investigation. Nothing flashy, just a small column about financial irregularities, governance failure, and donor accountability. That was enough. Respectability is fragile. Once cracked, it leaks fast. Margaret called me 6 times the first day and 14 the second. I let every call die unanswered. Then came texts. "You're destroying years of service. You do not understand the full picture. We can fix this. Family handles family matters privately." That last one made me smile. Ethan sent longer messages. Softer ones, sadder ones. He said he should have protected me. He said things went too far. He said he did not realize how much pressure Margaret was under. He said he missed me. He said maybe we could meet somewhere neutral. Neutral. As if there is neutral ground after someone watches you get thrown out and still chooses comfort over courage. My attorney handled the rest. The audit findings expanded. More board members admitted they had trusted Margaret's reporting without question. Several longtime donors demanded transparency before giving another dollar. The church launched an emergency restructuring effort and asked me, through counsel, whether I would consider future support under strict governance reforms. I said yes, not for Margaret, not for Ethan, not even for the institution as it had been, for the pantry families, the scholarship students, the women who came to the weekday support group and sat in the back trying not to cry, for the older members who relied on meal deliveries, for the people who needed service more than they needed spectacle. This time, my terms were not gentle. Independent oversight, quarterly public reporting, multi-signature controls, external audits, no donor mythology, no front row worship of wealthy families, no more turning money into moral theater. They agreed. A month later, I walked back into that sanctuary for the first board meeting under the new structure. The stained glass window still glowed in the afternoon light. The pews still smelled like polish and old hymnals. The organ still carried that low, golden sound through the room. But the air was different, cleaner. No Margaret in pearls. No Ethan trying to disappear into a suit. No applause for false saints. Just work. Honest, imperfect, necessary work. I sat at the long table with my binder open and listened as the board reviewed the new transparency protocols. Nobody called me help. Nobody patted my elbow. Nobody smiled at me like I was furniture with good manners. They addressed me by name. It should not have mattered as much as it did, but it did. Because after years of being made small, there is something almost holy about being seen clearly. I never went back to Margaret's house. I did not need to. Ethan moved into a furnished rental across town. Last I heard, Margaret was staying with a cousin and still telling anyone who would listen that she was the victim of a cruel overreaction. People like her do not repent, they revise. As for me, I rented a bright apartment with tall windows and terrible parking and a kitchen that was all mine. I bought a proper suitcase 2 weeks later and almost threw the broken one away. Then I kept it in the back of my closet. Not because I am sentimental, because I like reminders. I like remembering the sound it made rolling down the aisle while the truth caught up to them. I did not destroy that church. I removed the people who were using it as a stage. And if I sound cold when I say that, maybe I am. But tell me this. If the people who preached sacrifice had been feeding on your silence, your labor, your money, and your dignity for years, would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have let the whole room see exactly who kept the lights on?